Hello, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files. I am here co-hosting Canada and Palestine, the War on Zionism, the fifth episode, with Laith Marouf of Free Palestine Television. And so before we get going into things, we have a big announcement to make. We're shifting to weekly episodes. They'll be shorter, but weekly, more timely. So look forward to that. Laith, thanks for joining the Canada Files, for the next episode.
Thank you for having me.
All right, great. So let's get into things. Um, well, what is the state of affairs, for the axis of resistance and in the region?
Obviously, the biggest story is the crash of the helicopter carrying the president of Iran and the affairs minister, along with a few other members of the government. And that's been kind of the major story here. There's the funeral happening today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Many international leaders, heads of states, including President Putin of Russia, are there. On the ground in Gaza, today, May 22nd, Wednesdays, the Israelis have announced that they've had one of the hardest days in the battle on the ground. It's a continuation of over a week, almost now 10 days of a battle around Jabalia in the north of Gaza, and the Israelis are getting minced in those 10 days. At least a dozen officers have been announced killed by the Israelis. So obviously the numbers are much higher when we're talking about soldiers and others that have been injured. And on the front here in Lebanon, Hezbollah continues to conduct multi-layered, complex operations, destroying the bigger bases that are further away from the border with Palestine. And finally, Yemen had a huge naval battle today in the Red Sea against the American destroyers. We don't have full news on that, but that shows you how things are moving, even with the death of President Raisi of Iran.
All right, so I think one of the things that be important to discuss is I believe it was the defense minister made some sort of speech that kind of, and then of course, well, I mean the obvious thing too as well. You talked with Mitchell Lascaris, about the indictments, right? Or basically maybe a bit of a more summarized version of what you said to Lascaris. Your thoughts on that?
On the ICC arrest warrants?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, a lot of people were celebrating these unissued, yet to be issued arrest warrants. The request by the ICC prosecutor to have the court issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant, his minister of war, and Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza, Hania, the head of the political bureau of Hamas, and Laith, the head of the military wing. I personally believe it is nothing to celebrate, because it is the first time ever that a liberation movement struggling for decolonization and an end of an occupation of its territory is brought under criminal charges for their struggle and their use of violence to liberate themselves. So then you could imagine what this would have meant to people in Vietnam or people in Algeria during their struggle if they were charged with these ridiculous charges, or even as many problems with the charges that are being made. One of them is the issue that it's only relegated to Gaza and only starting from October 7th, 2023. So that means that all the crimes that the Zionists are committing in the rest of Palestine are excluded, including the colonization, and the killing and torture of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli gulags. It also, excludes, by definition, once you're now charging, the resistance of occupation as a crime, you could and imagine, like, in the situation of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, if the International Criminal Court came in and charged the Warsaw uprisers with crimes and only started the investigation from the day of the uprising. So all the crimes prior to that were committed by the Nazis would not be included in the resistance of the Jewish, Polish people in the Warsaw Ghetto being equated with the Nazi Holocaust. So this is what we have right now. So there's nothing to celebrate, and it was brought in by the Palestinian Authority, this case, because the Palestinian Authority is a colonial tool. It's like the band council leadership in Canada, and they wanted to actually undermine the resistance. This is what they did this as a favor to Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and those that are complaining now are, like the American leadership or others, are disingenuous because they know that there will be no real arrest warrants issued against Netanyahu, and nobody will implement them. But the leadership of Hamas will be the one that's hunted, especially Hania, who's residing in Qatar. But by the way, today Hania was in Tehran during the funeral of President Raisi, and he was the only foreign official allowed to give a speech at the funeral. So that shows you also what's going to be the results of these charges in terms of radicalizing the resistance even more and building their relationship deeper with Iran instead of what the West is trying to do with this.
Right. So thanks for those updates, Laith. Now shifting to the Canada side of affairs, there are some interesting elements on multiple fronts. The first two things I'm thinking about, one, there was an interesting piece in the Breach about the ex CBC producer, basically just really blatant anti-Palestinian bias. Solid piece. I'll give it credit. It's definitely gotten some waves. It got a CBC response. It's, well, to the average person, they wouldn't be shocked, but at the same time, somebody coming in from the inside, actually admitting the stuff, it is relevant. It is definitely relevant. So that's there from the Breach. You also had a interesting piece from Davide Mastracci, specifically around how he sent fake anti-Semitism claims to B'nai B'rith to check out their anti-Semitism audits, the annual ones. And he basically managed to get one passed on through without really scrutinization of who he was, etc. From what I could tell, this triggered a bit of a meltdown from Jesse Brown, who's a really ardent Zionist who runs Canada Land. So that's there. Those are two pretty interesting stories. You got the UQAM. They were another encampment. There's some videos CBC's reporting. Police were hitting some of the protesters. That's Université du Québec à Montréal. So that's the university that's being referenced. That's one thing for sure there. McGill, I believe there was they're trying to get an injunction again. I think this is their third attempt. I heard that from the Yves Engler show he does every Monday. So that's there. They're just truly desperate. Just incoherent, Zionist apologists. And then there was an agreement at Ontario tech. Now, from what I can tell, there's some potential victories, but it also kind of seem bureaucratic, and reports are apparently going to take months, and so there's kind of some suspect nature about the reports. I saw one or two kind of a local one, well, at least one local Toronto Palestine support kind of neighborhood focus group being pretty critical of the agreement. So it's hard to say if it's really a victory there. And then you got there's a campus around Kamloops. Again, Engler was pointing this out. Apparently, there's some sort of agreement that was set up there before an encampment was even set up. And those are the news points that immediately caught my eye in the last week or so. But like, I'm wondering if anything else caught your eye.
In Canada-wise,
Yeah.
obviously, I mean, you ran through a lot of stories there. Nothing comes to mind, but I would say clearly the story of the CBC is one of the important ones, given that, now some, people that didn't have an in on what was happening can understand. But I've had my experience with the CBC for years. I was involved in the license renewal for CBC hearings in 2021, and at that time, part of the hearing actually divulged into the issue of Palestine, and this is really one of the reasons that triggered the Zionist in the media in Canada against me, because we exposed their bias on Palestine at the hearing for their renewal, and we also exposed the fact that the CBC stands in violation of the Broadcasting Act in terms of employment and reflection for the Indigenous and racialized communities in Canada. For those who don't know, the Broadcasting Act stipulates that every licensed broadcaster has to reflect the diversity of Canada in its employment and in its programming, meaning right now in Canada, 7 or 8% of the population is Indigenous. That means that 7-8% of the employees at CBC should be Indigenous. And similarly, when we're talking like 24%, 23% racialized, that's the employment that should be at CBC. And the same has to be true about the programming. And CBC, along with all the broadcasters, every one of them in Canada that is licensed in the community radio and television sector, in the private radio and television sector, and in the government television and radio sector, they're all stand in violation with the Broadcasting Act since 1991. And the CRTC, as a censorship board, as a media management board on behalf of the colonial elite, has been hiding this fact and has been allowing these broadcasters to continue to be racist and colonialist, even in their employment and in their programming. And during that hearing of CBC, the CBC president, Madame, what's her name right now? I can't even remember her name. She said when she was asked, when will the CBC come into compliance with the Broadcasting Act, said she will have to wait for people to retire or die before she actually fixes her, this inequality in employment that exists at the CBC. So the reality is those who run, including, by the way, the CBC board is almost, at the time of the license renewal, was 100% white, okay? The board of directors of the CBC is 100% white at the time of the license. I don't know if they, brought in some people of color or Indigenous people to put on the board for show since then. But can you imagine? So, people shouldn't be surprised from what they read in this article in The Breach. It's actually worse than you can imagine. And it's not only about Palestine. CBC is mandated to fabricate the Canadian identity, which doesn't exist. There's European colonists, there's immigrants from Africa, from Asia. There's no such thing as Canadian culture or identity. There's no difference between a Canadian and an American or a Brit. They eat the same food, they consume the same media, they dance to the same music, they read the same articles, media that we or books or poetry. That's what makes a culture. Okay, so CBC is made to manufacture a fake identity. At the core of it is silencing everybody else that challenges this colonial identity.
All right, Laith. So if there's one last thing I would be thinking about, it would be, of course, the Trudeau, Joly Liberal government reaction to the ICC arrest warrants. They complained basically all moral equivalency between Palestinian resistance and Israel. Well, that is correct in this other sense that there is no equation between the genocidal, fascist Israeli regime, the Zionist regime, and the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance is not a genocidal, force. Israel is. So it's kind of typical of the colonial state, anyways. They hate anti-colonial resistance. And speaking of that, I will mention one more thing, which is Jeremy Levy, the Hempstead mayor. I saw Eve was kind of Evangler was kind of ruminating about could Jeremy Levy be the conservative candidate in Anthony Housefather's riding, because he went to a Zionist rally. Apparently Housefather and Trudeau couldn't give a message. They were blocked off. But Levy was able to speak. Conservatives were able to speak. So it's kind of like maybe it's the starts of like a smaller version of like the internal Zionist dynamics where they're like basically careening towards a civil war. And I wonder, do you think there's going to be like an intra-Zionist civil war, pretty much between like the liberal Zionists and Zionists that are more likely to go to the conservatives?
Yeah, I mean, we already saw that in a smaller scale with the attacks on me and how the Zionists in the parliament were cannibalizing each other to show who can be more hateful towards me and so on. And so and I think people should also be expecting that the elections in Canada could happen sooner than they think. Look at how Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of England, just called a snap election just this morning, and they're going to have an election on July 4th. And the reason that Sunak called this snap election is because he could see the rise of new parties like the Workers' Party led by George Galloway, and that if he gives them enough time to build on the ground, that they may not only take away Labor seats, but also Conservative seats, and may even be close to governing. So similarly in Canada, I think the progressives, anti-colonialists, so on, should be getting themselves ready now for a snap election that could be called any minute. If people want any change, real change, they need to organize in the same manner that the Workers' Party is organizing in the UK, create an alliance between the European colonist working class and the anti-colonial, anti-war movement. Otherwise, there's no hope. There will be not much change. In fact, the conservatives, it's clearly the conservatives now have a more support from the Zionist camp, and the Zionists are attempting to get as many Nazi fascist-like parties to be elected in the West as possible. And they will be putting their money behind the conservatives in Canada, that's for sure.
All right, Laith. Well, thank you for the insight there, and that's where this episode's going to end. Thank you to the viewers of Canfiles for watching the episode all the way to the end. And as per the discussion at the beginning, this is a weekly show, so look for it again next week. Thanks for watching, everybody. Goodbye.